Well, good morning. Welcome to Chapter 5, our first chapter in the actual grammar section. And I would imagine that some of you were a bit surprised to find in a Greek grammar a whole chapter on English grammar. The reason for that is that so many people don't know enough about English grammar, and until they know their English grammar, I can't teach them anything about Greek grammar. So in Chapter 5, I'm going to introduce the basics of the English noun system. In Chapter 15, I'll introduce the basics of the English verbal system. And then what I do at the beginning of each chapter is give you a little more English grammar before we get into that particular chapter. The problem is that I need to teach you, for example, about the Greek nominative case. But I can't teach you the nominative case until you know the English subjective case, and in fact, I can't teach you the nominative case until you know what a case is. So we need to spend this time in English. The first thing we need to learn is the whole concept of inflection. Inflection basically means that the form of a word can be altered depending upon either its meaning or its function in the sentence. Now, English is not very inflected. The personal pronouns are inflected, but that's about it. Greek is highly inflected. That's why this is so important. But for example, in terms of meaning affecting a word's form, in the pronoun, if it's a man, we would refer to him as he. If it's a woman, we'd refer to her as she. Okay, that's inflection. It's still the same pronoun. It's a third person singular pronoun, but its form changes because of its meaning. Likewise, you can have a prince if it's male, or a princess if she's female. So those are just a few examples in English of how the meaning of a word can change its form. This is inflection. But inflection also comes to play in terms of a word's function. If the third person pronoun is functioning as the subject of the sentence, you would say, she is a student at Gordon Conwell. But if that same pronoun is functioning, for example, as a direct object, we would not say she, we would say her, right? Okay. These are just examples of what inflection is in English, but the basic concept is quite straightforward. A word can change its form depending upon either its meaning or its function in the sentence. Is that clear? There's three different aspects of grammar that you need to know in connection with the concept of inflection. The first has to do with case. Okay, depending upon what case the word is in, can affect the form of a word. Take, for example, the sentence, God loves his people. The word God is acting as the subject of the verb, and therefore in English it's in the subjective case. People is acting as the direct object, and therefore is in the English objective case. And his is functioning to show possession, and so is in the possessive case. Those are the three cases in English. Now you notice that the word God and people don't change their form, whether the subject or the direct object. But words generally change their form when they're showing possession. It's the apostrophe S business in English. How do you define the subject of a sentence? Basic grammar, but you've just got to know this stuff. What's the subject of a verb? Yeah, basically the subject is the word that performs the action of the verb. God loves. Who loves? God loves. The direct object is just the other side of things. It's the word that receives the action of the verb. God loves his people. Is God doing the loving? It's the people being loved. So we have subjects in English that are put in the subjective case, and we have direct objects that are put in the objective case. And if a word is showing possession, it's in the possessive case. Is that clear? All right. The second thing that affects inflection is the issue of number. And in English we have two numbers, singular and plural. And most words are inflected in English to indicate number, right? There are a few that can be singular and plural. I have collective nouns and a few other things like that. We basically have singular, one, or plural, more than one. And the third thing that can affect inflection is the whole issue of gender. And again, in English, we don't generally differentiate gender except in the pronouns. So if the subject is masculine, we would say he. If it's feminine, we would say she. And if it's anything else, we say it. So in other words, we have three genders in English: masculine, feminine, and neuter. And English generally follows what is called natural gender. In other words, do you think of Matt as a male or a female? Well, we think of Matt as a male, and therefore we refer to your head TA as he. But if it's a rock, you generally would say it. There's one other thing related to inflection you need to know, and I'm using the word declension. It's not actually an English grammatical term as far as I know. I don't think there is one in English, but it's the Greek term, so we'll use it in this case. All that declension means is that different words follow different patterns of inflection. In other words, there's patterns that English follows in inflecting its words, right? For example, what is the general way of shifting from singular to plural? You add an S. Okay, that's one inflectional pattern. But another pattern is to shift one of the stem vowels. And so man goes to men. And then there's another pattern that doesn't differentiate number. And so fish goes to fish. In other words, you can have one fish or you can have a whole bunch of fish. And the singular and plural forms are the same. So all that I want you to see at this point is that words will follow different inflectional patterns. Few other odds and ends in this chapter, and again, I'm not covering everything in the chapter, so be sure you read it all carefully. Subject and predicate, this is a confusing thing in English grammar because the same words have different meanings in different contexts. What I mean when I talk about subjects and predicate in this context is that you can divide a sentence into two basic parts. You can divide a sentence into its subject, and that means the subject of the verb and anything that modifies it. The big bad teacher, so that would all be considered the subject. And then the predicate is the verb and everything else. Is teaching too long this morning. Okay, so when we talk about dividing a sentence into its subject and its predicate, the subject is the subject of the verb and everything that modifies it, and the predicate is everything else, especially the verb. What we're going to learn to do is to divide sentences into their halves and then subdivide them further. So I'll be talking about dividing a sentence into its subject and predicate. There's one thing I need to say about verbs. We generally put off verbs until chapter 15. There's going to be some more verbs in chapter 8. But up front, you need to know something about verbs in order to do the exercises for this chapter. In a Greek verb, the speaker always identifies the person and number of the subject. And they do it by adding an ending onto it. For example, if you see su graphes, su is the second person personal pronoun, means you, singular. Graphes, the word graph, lexical form is grapho, it means I write. But graphes, epsilon iota sigma, is a second person singular ending, meaning you. In other words, the verb has to agree with its subject. So su graphes means you write. Now here's the little tricky part. Because the subject is contained in the verb, the Greeks don't have to actually give you the subject. In other words, Paul could say su graphes, or he could say graphes. And both mean the same thing. They both mean you write. So what I do in the exercise is after every verb, when I give you the definition of the verb in parentheses, I will also give you the person and number. I will say I write, or you write, or if it's third person, I'll say he, she, it writes, and you have to figure out from the context whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter. But the point is that you're going to have some exercises that don't have an express subject. Don't have to have an express subject. The subject can be in the verb.